All right, gentlemen, good evening. This week we're going to start what amounts to really 2 weeks, even though it is two separate chapters. 2 weeks of focusing on ecology and looking at ecosystems. This is the part of the course that I find to be the most interesting and the most exciting. And topically, even though it is two different chapters, one chapter per week, topically, we do spend 2 weeks on the topic. It's the section in the book or the topic in the book that we spend the most amount of time on. I think ecology is a little bit more interesting than some of the other stuff we've looked at, and so we will spend some time focusing on these two chapters. This is going to be chapter 4 and chapter 5 in particular. So what we're going to do in chapter 4 is we're going to do a lecture on the first section and the third section. I skipped the second section. The second section of the book covers evolution, and what I do to cover evolution is show a video that discusses that, so we will have that this week. This first lecture is a pretty short one. It's only 13 slides. We have again here preview of different things we're going to talk about. That continues here. I want you guys to focus on these objectives again in terms of being prepared for the oral quiz, but even more so than that, just understanding the concepts. So these are listed here for you to go ahead and take a look at and use as study guides as you go over the concepts of the chapter. Now, what is an ecosystem? We're going to start at the basic level, and we're going to do a big picture discussion, and then we're going to drill down to some details. An ecosystem, ecosystems are defined as communities of organisms in their abiotic environments. And this is one of those definitions that has terms within it that we're eventually going to have to define as well. So in order for you to really understand and know the concept of what an ecosystem is, you're going to have to understand what communities are, what organisms are, what abiotic environments are, and we're going to talk about all of that as well. Ecosystems can be really, really large, and they can be pretty small. An oak forest is an ecosystem. A coral reef is an ecosystem. But you know what? We can take a leaf off of the tree in that oak forest, and that leaf would have an ecosystem that it sustains in and of itself, just as the leaf. So we can take a drop of water out of a pond and look at that drop of water under the microscope, and that drop of water in and of itself would have an ecosystem. So again, they can be really large, but they can also be really small, and that's important to remember, especially as we start applying some of these details from the definition that we're talking about. Ecosystems do not have clear boundaries. We can talk about the oak forest being an ecosystem, but there's going to be things that start in the oak forest and then end up somewhere else. There's going to be things that start in the pasture land that end up in the oak forest. So the boundaries in terms of ecosystems tend to bleed into one another. They are not distinct lines that can be drawn. And as it says here again about these boundaries, things move from one to another. Pollen is a great example that can start in a forest and blow into a field. And over the course of time, that is how the field ultimately becomes part of the forest. Soil can start in a mountain, and over the course of weathering and erosion, that soil can wash into a lake and be part of that lake's ecosystem. Now, birds migrate from state to state. So ecosystems, again, there are no clear, distinct lines of demarcation in terms of ecosystems. This diagram, which is in your textbook, shows the organization of an ecosystem. And basically, we start down on the bottom right-hand corner. You have an organism. That is an individual living being. When you put a bunch of the same organism together, we call that a population. Okay, that's one step up. When you put a bunch of populations together, so this group of this organism living together with this group of this organism, living together with this group of a third organism. We call that a community. And then when you put a bunch of communities together, that is what makes up the ecosystem. And we're studying this at the ecosystem level. I have not gotten to a place yet where I'm able to look at the different biomes, but when you put ecosystems in an area together, that creates a biome. Our studies are going to really focus from the organism up to the ecosystem. Now, what are the things that organisms need, or I should say, what are the things that an ecosystem needs in order for the ecosystem to survive? What I'm talking about here are basic, fundamental components, guys. Energy, and in terms of ecosystems, we are going to talk about energy a lot. Mineral nutrients, water, oxygen, and then, of course, the living organisms. You cannot take out any one of those things and expect your ecosystem to survive for any lengthy period of time. And we're actually going to run some simulations in one of the labs to show how food webs are affected and change when you change just one part of them, to give us an example of what we're talking about here. We also have things that are like plants and rocks that we would connect to land ecosystems. And we recognize that, again, I said energy becomes very important. We talk a lot about it. Most of the energy of any ecosystem comes from the sun. So we see here that the sun is the driving, it is the engine, if you will, for any ecosystem, be it land or a water-based ecosystem. The sun is what is the initial energy input source for that ecosystem. And then what we'll do is we'll, over time, talk about how the energy, once it enters into the ecosystem from the sun, how that energy then moves around and within the ecosystem. And the big picture here, guys, that I think is really important for you to start grasping is that everything is interconnected. So you cannot change or take away or destroy one part, even one very small and tiny part of the ecosystem, and assume that it doesn't have any impact, any effect on the rest of the ecosystem. That's just untrue. Any change has an effect on every other aspect of the ecosystem. And that's why we talk about it being interconnected. So what are these factors? We talk about biotic and abiotic factors within an ecosystem. Biotic factors are environmental factors that are associated with or result from the activities of living organisms. This is plants, animals, dead organisms, waste products. So anything within the ecosystem that in some way, shape, or form is connected with or comes from a living organism is a biotic factor. We can drill this down right to the poop or the waste products, if you will, that organisms create. Okay, decomposing organic material, dead animals, dead plants. Those are all vital to the ecosystem, and they are biotic factors because they come from living things. But we also have what we call abiotic factors, and these are environmental factors that are not associated with the activities of living organisms. Air, water, rocks, temperature, these will be, for the most part, just as vital, just as important. You can't take these away, you can't remove them and say it doesn't have any impact, but they have no association with something that is alive or that was once living. And what we do is we organize the biotic and the abiotic factors into different levels of organization categories so that we can keep track of them. This helps us to understand their interconnections. Organisms, as you saw in the diagram, organisms are living things that can carry out life processes independently. You know, one of the things, guys, I think is really important, I think is a common mistake at this level for you as students, is we automatically assume that organisms are animals. Okay, we automatically assume that organisms are animals, and that's not the case. It's much more precise to think of organisms as anything that's alive. And in fact, part of our definition is that they can live independently of anything else. So that includes plants, and that includes animals, that includes bacteria, and that includes fungus, and so on and so forth. It's varied. We are organisms, and ants are organisms, and a plant like ivy is an organism, and bacteria that is within our guts are organisms. So the other aspect of this is that you have organisms within organisms. And generally what we do today in zoology and in botany and other categories is we divide organisms up into species. So every organism is a member of a species. And we define species as groups of organisms that are closely related and can mate to produce fertile offspring. So, a particular animal, for instance, let's say orangutans are considered a species, and they can mate with other orangutans. Now, you're going to hear this in the video, and the idea that we have in biology today of dividing things up into species, it's very, very messy because we don't have any clear-cut lines of definition. We have found examples where we thought things were different species, and then they're able to mate. Okay, for example, I remember back when I was in college, it was big news because for years and years and years, biologists just thought it was interesting. You have polar bears and you have grizzly bears, and they're members of different species, and technically, therefore, they shouldn't be able to mate. But there was lots of conjecture that the southernmost range of the polar bears and the northernmost range of the grizzly bears would overlap. And there was lots of, what would happen, what happens if they're in the same space, in the same area, blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. And there's researchers that are out there doing that research. And lo and behold, one day they catch a glimpse of a bear that doesn't look necessarily like a polar bear, doesn't look necessarily like a grizzly bear. It looks a little bit like one and a little bit like the other. And they eventually are able to get a sample and do some DNA sampling and realize that what they have is an offspring of a polar bear and a grizzly bear. This is, earth-shattering news in the zoological and biological community. This is years ago now. Because, number one, now they have proof that their ranges did overlap because these two bears would have had to have had contact with each other in order to mate. And number two, you have yet another example of two organisms that were thought to be two different species were able to mate. We have horses and donkeys who are able to mate and produce mules. And like 98% of the time, mules are completely sterile. And yet, every once in a while, we find that there's a mule that gives birth. So it was impregnated by, usually the case is a horse. And so I tell you all this to say the categories of species is really, really a gray area. And we find it's very, very difficult to keep and to maintain. But we have that definition, and that is going to be our working definition. In terms of populations, again, as we define these, we saw them in the diagram. Members of a species may not all live in the same place. Field mice in Maine will not interact with field mice in Texas. However, each organism lives as part of a population. Population, how we determine whether or not an organism is part of a population as opposed to another population. Population is determined by breeding and by geography. Okay, if you take field mice, and I go, around the corner here, and there's a cornfield, and there's a bunch of field mice, and I go up the road a mile, and there's a wheat field, and there's a bunch of field mice, they may be the same species, they may be the same mice, but it's two different populations. And the reason that is, guys, is that in nature, a field mouse, just like any other organism, is pragmatic, meaning it's practical and it's opportunistic. Field mice in the cornfield right around the corner are not going to go a mile down the road to find the field mice in the wheat field so that they can mate with them. Every animal's doing some kind of a cost benefit analysis, so to speak. And why would they do that when there's perfectly good field mice that they can breed here in the cornfield? The animals are not humans. The field mice in the cornfield don't say, you know what, I think the girl field mice over in the wheat field are prettier, and I'm gonna go over there. It's not how it happens in nature. And so we define population based on breeding opportunity within a geographical location. Now, it doesn't mean that field mice in the cornfield aren't going to get to the wheat field. They might jump on a tractor that ends up, working both fields and things like that. But generally, it's too easy for us to. I mean, the Disney movies that have been made, the Disney nature movies, which I think do a great job of, giving us a glimpse into a world that we wouldn't normally get to see. I remember March of the Penguins was one of the first ones that kind of came out and popularized these movies. Part of the problem is when we view these things, when we view the life of the animal, it is so easy for us to personify what that animal is doing and why it's doing it. We start to think of it as being motivated by the same things that motivate human beings. And for the most part, that is just not the case. Field mice in the cornfield are never going to leave the cornfield. They've got shelter, they've got food, they've got mating opportunities. And that's how we, in ecology, tend to define populations. So that's something that you definitely are going to want to keep in mind. Okay, so the definition then is populations are groups of organisms of the same species that live in a specific geographical area and interbreed. And it's really just that simple. And again, the example being the field mice. Now, as we continue to look at population, we see that members usually breed with one another rather than members of another population, and we've talked about that. We've explained why. Use bison here as an example. Wildflowers, are pollinating within the same field. This has to do with practicality as much as anything else. And then we move up to communities. And communities are groups of various species that live in the same habitat and interact with each other. Just think of the diagram that kicked this whole discussion off. Every population is part of a community. So in ecology, we do not view a population as living unto itself. Anytime there is a population of an organism, that population is going to be part of a larger community. It doesn't just interact with itself for its own survival. It ends up interacting with other populations and other organisms for everyone's survival. The idea here, guys, is that every organism in the ecosystem has a role to play that affects and impacts all the other organisms. And then with communities, we can look at communities and see different communities as different one from another, and that's driven by the types of species that are extant or in that particular area or that community. And we can, as an example, look at land communities dominated by a few species of plants, and they determine what other organisms can live in that community. One land community is going to have a certain type of plants, and it's going to have different organisms living there than another land community that has a completely different group of plants. And that brings us to the idea of habitat. And habitat, by definition, are places where organisms usually live. And I want you guys, for purposes of this class, to not think any more complicated than that. Define habitat as the place where the organism lives. Okay? Because we're going to have to understand habitat in terms of niche. And niche and habitat are not the same thing. Although it's very, very common at this level for students to be taught that they're basically synonyms, they aren't. Okay? They are very different. A habitat has specific characteristics that organisms live their need to survive. And any of these factors change, the habitat changes. Last Christmas break, a year ago, when I took my family to Florida the week after Christmas, we were at a state park, and we went on this trail with family for a little hike, and the trail was called Gopher Turtle or Gopher Tortoise Trail, and it was called that because there was a particular species of land turtle that was a gopher turtle, and they lived there specifically because, and they were called gopher turtles specifically because they made burrows. And we were walking along, and all of a sudden we saw off to the right this kind of big kind of mound, and we, my kids want to look at it, and you go up this little hill, and you realize it's a giant hole, and the turtle is actually sitting in the mouth of the hole, just like a gopher or a woodchuck would do. That's their habitat. That is how they are adapted and where they are adapted to live. We don't have that type of turtle in Virginia. We didn't have that type of turtle in New York. Why is that? Because they need to have a sandy environment for their habitat because they dig burrows. You don't dig a burrow in Virginia red clay. Okay? So habitat is very important. It's very specific to the organism, and it ends up driving the organisms that you have in a particular area. As it says here, organisms are well suited to their natural habitats. And in fact, animals cannot survive for long away from their habitat very often. So that's important for us to understand.